Most men fear losing half their fortune in a divorce. Brandon Pierce, he was celebrating. He thought he had pulled off the perfect crime, hiding his millions, gaslighting his wife, and trading her in for a younger, hungrier model. He stood in that courtroom, signed the papers with a smirk, and thought he was the smartest man in the room. He thought his wife Julia was just a quiet, broken woman with a nobody for a father. He was wrong, dead wrong. By the time the ink was dry, he wouldn't just lose his marriage, he was about to lose his entire existence. Because the man he called a useless old pensioner was about to teach him a lesson that money can't buy. The champagne cork popped with a sound that echoed like a gunshot in the cavernous, minimalist living room of the penthouse. Brandon Pierce watched the froth spill over the neck of the bottle, laughing as it dripped onto the Italian marble floor. He didn't care. He could afford to replace the marble. He could afford to replace the entire building if he wanted to freedom. Tiffany purred, sliding her arms around his waist from behind. Her nails painted a sharp crimson, dug possessively into his silk shirt. Brandon turned, handing her a crystal flute. To upgrading, he corrected, clicking his glass against hers. They stood overlooking the city skyline, the glittering jewels of the financial district spread out below them. Brandon took a long sip, savoring the taste of victory. Today was the day he had finally served Julia the papers. Did she cry? Tiffany asked, her eyes gleaming with malicious curiosity. She was 24, ambitious, and had been Brandon's executive assistant for 6 months before becoming his mistress. She loved the drama as much as she loved his credit card limit. Surprisingly, no, Brandon said, frowning slightly as he recalled the morning. He had expected a scene. He had prepared for tears, screaming, maybe even some throwing of crockery. He had his lawyer, Arthur Banks, on speed dial, ready to call the police if Julia got hysterical. That was the narrative he had been building for months. Julia was unstable. Julia was emotional. Julia was unfit. But when he threw the envelope onto the kitchen island, right next to her half-finished cup of herbal tea, she had simply looked at it. She was wearing that oversized gray cardigan. He hated her hair pulled back in a messy bun. She looked plain, boring, so different from the sharp, vibrant woman he had married 10 years ago. She just asked if I was sure. Brandon chuckled, shaking his head. Can you believe that? Are you sure? Brandon saw like she was giving me a chance to back out. Pathetic, Tiffany sneered. She probably thinks she can guilt you into staying. She doesn't realize you've outgrown her. I outgrew her 5 years ago, Brandon said, turning back to the window. Julia is comfortable. She's a sedan. Reliable, slow, boring. You, my dear, he ran a hand down Tiffany's arm, are a Ferrari. Brandon Pierce was a man who defined himself by what he owned. As the senior vice president of sales at Omnicorp Global, a logistics and supply chain behemoth worth billions, Brandon was used to getting what he wanted. He was 38, handsome in a jagged, aggressive way, and ruthless. He had married Julia when he was just a junior manager. Back then, her quiet support and her father's modest wedding gift had helped them put a down payment on a starter home. But as Brandon climbed the corporate ladder, stepping on fingers to get to the next rung, Julia had stayed the same. She worked part-time at a local library. She volunteered at animal shelters. She was content with enough. Brandon hated enough. So the assets, Tiffany asked, getting to the point. Brandon's grin widened. This was his masterpiece. Arthur assured me it's ironclad. I've been moving funds into offshore shell companies for 2 years. The Cayman accounts are under a trust name that doesn't exist. On paper, I'm almost broke. The penthouse is leased by the company. The cars are leased. My salary decreased last quarter due to market volatility. She'll get the old house in the suburbs and a pitiful alimony check. I keep the rest. You're a genius. Tiffany kissed him, leaving a lipstick stain on his jaw. And her father, the scary Papa Bear. Brandon laughed out loud, a harsh barking sound. William, please. The man is a ghost. I've met him maybe 5 times in 10 years. He lives in some cabin in Montana or Wyoming. I don't even know. Sends Julia a card on her birthday and a check for $50. 50. Tiffany, he's a retired mechanic or lumberjack. He wears flannel and probably smells like sawdust. He has no idea who he's dealing with. The intercom buzzed. It was the concierge. Mr. Pierce, your car is ready for the gala, the voice said. We're coming down, Brandon replied. Tonight was the Omnicorp annual gala. It was the biggest event of the season. CEOs, politicians, and industry titans would be there. Brandon planned to introduce Tiffany as his partner. It was a bold move, bringing her out on the same day he served divorce papers. But Brandon felt invincible. He wanted the world to see his upgrade. As they walked to the elevator, Brandon checked his reflection in the hallway mirror. He adjusted his tie. He looked powerful. He looked like a winner. He had no idea that across town, in a small, dimly lit study filled with the scent of old paper and pipe tobacco, a phone call was being made that would shatter his world. Julia sat at her kitchen table. The divorce papers lay open in front of her. The legal jargon was aggressive, designed to intimidate. Irreconcilable differences. Spousal support denied. Property division final. She wasn't crying, she wasn't shaking. She felt a strange cold clarity. For years, she had looked the other way. She had smelled the perfume on his shirts. Tiffany's cheap, overly sweet vanilla scent. She had noticed the business trips that coincided with weekends in Carbo or Aspen. She had seen the bank notifications he thought he had hidden. She had stayed because of a promise she made to herself to try, to honor her vows, to see the man she fell in love with, not the monster he had become. But watching Brandon this morning, the sneer on his face, the utter lack of respect in his eyes, the man she loved was dead. She picked up her phone, Mom. It was an old model cracked screen. Brandon always made fun of it. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 3 years. It rang twice. Ellie, a deep, growly voice answered. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that vibrated through the speaker. Hi, Dad, Julia said softly. You sound different, William said immediately. He didn't waste words on pleasantries. What happened? Bond served me papers today. There was a silence on the other end, a long, heavy silence. I see. He's leaving me for his assistant. He thinks he's hidden all the money, Dad. He thinks I don't know about the accounts in Zurich and the Caymans. He thinks I'm stupid. Are you asking for help, Ellie? William asked. You know the rule. You wanted to live a normal life. You wanted to make it on your own without the shadow. I respected that. I know, Julia said, her voice trembling for the first time. I wanted to be loved for me, not for everything else. But he's trying to destroy me, Dad. He's mocking me. He called you a pensioner. A low chuckle rumbled down the line. It wasn't a happy sound. It sounded like a bear waking up from hibernation, hungry and irritated. Did he now? He's bringing her to the Omnicorp gala tonight, Julia whispered. He's going to parade her around in front of everyone while the ink is still wet. Ellie, William's voice dropped an octave. Do you want to walk away or do you want to burn it down? Julia looked around the house she had spent 10 years cleaning, decorating, and turning into a home, only to be told it was worth nothing. She thought of the years of emotional neglect, the gaslighting, the arrogance. I want him to know who he really messed with, she said, her voice hardening. I want to burn it down. Good, William said. Put on that black dress, the vintage one. I'll send a car. Not the sedan, the Phantom. Dad, you don't have to. I'm not coming as a mechanic tonight, Ellie. I'm coming as a father who is very, very displeased. The Omnicorp Gala was held at the Grand Metropolitan Hall. Chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the gold-leafed ceiling. The room smelled of expensive cologne, truffles, and money. Brandon worked the room like a shark in a koi pond. With Tiffany on his arm, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that left little to the imagination, he shook hands with board members and laughed at jokes that weren't funny. Brandon, my boy, Arthur Banks, his lawyer, clapped him on the shoulder. Arthur was a greasy man with a comb-over and a suit that cost more than most people's cars. I heard the news. Congratulations on shedding the dead weight. Couldn't have done it without you, Arthur. Brandon grinned. Is the asset protection holding tight as a drum? Arthur winked. She could hire the best forensic accountant in the city and they'd find dust. You're legally a porpa, my friend. They laughed together, a conspiratorial sound that made a waiter nearby flinch. Look at them, Tiffany whispered, pointing her chin toward the entrance. The CEO is here. Gregory Vance, the CEO of Omnicorp, walked in. He was a formidable man, usually surrounded by a phalanx of security and assistants. But tonight he looked nervous. He was checking his watch, wiping sweat from his forehead. He wasn't mingling. He was waiting near the grand entrance doors, looking agitated. That's odd, Brandon murmured. Gregory never waits for anyone. He makes people wait for him. Maybe a celebrity is coming, Tiffany suggested. Maybe Brandon straightened his tie. Come on, let's go say hello. If I can get Gregory to like you, the VP of Operations role is as good as mine. Brandon steered Tiffany toward the CEO. Gregory, good evening. Gregory Vance jumped slightly, turning to face them. His eyes were distracted. Pierce, not now. Brandon blinked. He wasn't used to being dismissed. I just wanted to introduce you two, I said. Not now, Brandon. Gregory snapped, his voice uncharacteristically high. The chairman is arriving. He's never attended a gala before. This is unprecedented. Brandon froze. The chairman, you mean the majority shareholder? I thought that was a holding company. Ares Ventures. Ares Ventures is a person, Brandon, Gregory hissed, adjusting his tuxedo cuffs frantically. A very private, very powerful person. He bought the majority stake 3 days ago. Hostile takeover, but silent. We didn't even know until this morning. If he doesn't like what he sees tonight, heads are going to roll. So get out of the way. Brandon stepped back, pulling Tiffany with him. A hostile takeover. Why wasn't I briefed? Because you're just sales, Brandon, Tiffany whispered, though she looked worried too. If the new owner cleans house, relax, Brandon scoffed, recovering his composure. I'm the top earner in the company. My numbers are untouchable. Whoever this chairman is, he'll need me. The room suddenly went quiet. The murmuring of hundreds of guests died down, replaced by a hush that swept from the entrance to the back of the hall. The massive double doors swung open, but it wasn't a man who walked in first. It was Julia. Brandon's jaw dropped. Tiffany let out a small gasp. Julia wasn't wearing the gray cardigan. She was wearing a black velvet gown that hugged her figure, elegant and lethal. Her hair was down, cascading in waves over her shoulders. She wore diamonds around her neck, stones so large and clear they caught the light and threw it back with blinding intensity. She walked with a grace Brandon had never seen, her head held high, her eyes scanning the room with cool detachment. What is she doing here? Brandon hissed, panic rising in his chest. She's not on the list. Security. He started to move forward, to intercept her, to harass her, to throw her out. Julia, he called out, his voice cutting through the silence. This is a private event. You need to leave. Julia stopped. She turned her head slowly, locking eyes with him. She didn't flinch. She didn't look down. She looked bored. And who is that? Brandon pointed a shaking finger at the man walking in behind her. The man was older, perhaps in his late 60s. He was built like a mountain, broad-shouldered and imposing. He wore a tuxedo that fit him perfectly, but he wore it with the ease of a man who didn't care about clothes. He had a thick white beard and eyes that looked like crushed granite. He walked with a cane, not out of weakness, but as if it were a weapon. Gregory Vance, the CEO, practically ran forward, bowing his head. Mr. Sanders, welcome. We are so honored. Brandon's brain short-circuited. Sanders' Julia's maiden name was Sanders, but her father was William Sanders, the mechanic, the nobody. The older man ignored the CEO. He walked straight past him, his heavy steps thudding on the carpet. He walked right up to Brandon, towering over him by a good 4 in. The man looked at Brandon, then at Tiffany, then back at Brandon. He sniffed the air, smelling the fear. You must be Brandon, the man said. His voice was the same deep rumble Julia had heard on the phone, but magnified by the acoustics of the hall. I'm William Sanders, Brandon stammered. Julia's father, but you fix cars. William smiled. It was a terrifying expression. I fix problems, son. I started with cars 40 years ago. Then I started buying the companies that made the cars. Then the companies that shipped the cars. He gestured around the room like this one. The realization hit Brandon like a physical blow. Ares Ventures. Ares, the god of war. William Sanders, you own Omnicorp, Brandon whispered, his face draining of blood. As of this morning, William said pleasantly, I bought it for a very specific reason. He put a heavy hand on Julia's shoulder. My daughter told me she was dealing with some pests. I like to handle pest control personally. The silence in the Grand Metropolitan Hall was suffocating. It was the kind of silence usually reserved for funerals or the seconds before a bomb detonation. 3 of the city's elite held their breath, their eyes darting between Brandon Pierce, whose face had gone a sickly shade of gray, and William Saunders, the titan who had just claimed ownership of their world. Pest control, Brandon squeaked. His bravado was evaporating like water on a hot skillet. He looked at Gregory, the CEO, for support, but Gregory was busy inspecting the pattern of the carpet, desperate to avoid eye contact. William didn't answer immediately. He slowly unbuttoned his tuxedo jacket, looking relaxed, as if he were standing on his porch rather than in a ballroom. "You see, Brandon," William began his voice, carrying without a microphone. "I've been watching the numbers for Omnicorp for a long time. Impressive sales, very impressive. But the overhead, the miscellaneous expenses, the logistics routing through the Caymans," William tuttered, shaking his head. "Sloppy. I, I don't know what you're talking about," Brandon stammered, his heart hammering against his ribs. "I'm in sales. I don't handle logistics. You do when you're skimming off the top to fund a lifestyle you can't afford," William said, his voice hardening. "And you definitely do when you're trying to hide assets from your wife during a divorce." A ripple of whispers broke out across the room. Tiffany pulled her arm away from Brandon's as if he were radioactive. "That's a lie," Brandon shouted, trying to regain control of the narrative. He straightened his back, channeling the arrogance that had served him well for years. "This is slander. You may be rich, Mr. Sanders, but you can't just walk in here and accuse a senior executive of embezzlement without proof. I'll sue you for defamation." Julia stepped forward. The movement was small, but it drew every eye. She reached into her small beaded clutch and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It wasn't a legal document. It was a receipt, a simple, crumpled receipt. "You left this in your jacket pocket 3 months ago, Brandon," Julia said. Her voice was calm, melodic, even. It was the voice of a woman who had spent years being yelled at and had finally realized the yeller was just a noise. "It's from a bank in Zurich. You thought you shredded it. You didn't." Brandon stared at the paper. You, you went through my pockets." "I did your laundry, Brandon," she said simply. "For 10 years, I've found a lot of things. Movie ticket stubs for films we never saw, hotel receipts for weekends you said you were working. And this." She handed the paper to her father. William didn't even look at it. He just smiled at Brandon. "My team of forensic accountants has been inside the Omnicorp servers since 400 a.m. this morning. You used the company VPN to manage your shell accounts, Brandon. Rookie mistake. You thought you were hiding your money from Julia. You were actually leaving a digital footprint on my servers. And since I own the servers, I own the data." William turned to the terrified CEO, Gregory. "Gregory, is Mr. Pierce's company credit card active?" "Ah, yes, sir, of course," Gregory stammered. "Cancel it," William ordered, "and freeze his salary. Effective immediately. Mr. Pierce is terminated for cause. Gross misconduct, embezzlement, and breach of fiduciary duty." "You can't do that," Brandon screamed. "I have a contract. I have a severance package. I have rights. You have the right to remain silent," William said coldly. "But I doubt you have the capacity." William gestured to the back of the room. Two men in dark suits, not security, but something far more serious, stepped forward. They were holding a tablet and a thick file. "This is Mr. Clean from the district attorney's office." William introduced the lead man. "He's very interested in how you managed to evade taxes on the $3 million you moved offshore last year. Since Omnicorp is now cooperating fully with the investigation, we've handed over all your emails, even the ones you deleted from the trash folder." Brandon felt the room spin. The trash folder. He had deleted everything, but he forgot that corporate servers have backups. Backups of backups. He turned to Tiffany, desperate for an ally. "Tiffany, tell them. We tell them I'm innocent." Tiffany took a step back, her face a mask of disgust. She looked at Brandon, then at the billionaire William Sanders, and finally at the stunning diamond-draped Julia. She did the math instantly. "I don't know what he's done," Tiffany said loudly, addressing the room. "I was just his assistant. He told me he was separated. I had no idea about any fraud." "Tiffany?" Brandon gasped, betrayed. "Don't look at me," she hissed. "I'm not going to jail for you." She turned on her heel and walked away, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Brandon alone in the center of the circle. Julia walked up to him. She was close enough that he could smell her perfume, a new scent, something smoky and expensive. not the lavender soap he was used to. You wanted a divorce, Brandon, she said softly. You wanted to trade me in, and you wanted to leave me with nothing. Julia, wait, Brandon whispered, sweat pouring down his face. Baby, please, we can talk about this. Your dad, he's misunderstanding everything. I did this for us to save for our future. Julia laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. You're still doing it. You're still lying. You signing the papers, Brandon. You remember you were celebrating this morning. I can tear them up, Brandon cried. I'll tear them up right now. We can start over. No, Julia said. I signed them too just before we came here. They are filed. We are divorced. And since you signed a financial disclosure stating you had limited assets, and my father's lawyers have just proven you have millions in stolen company funds. Well, that's perjury, Brandon. And fraud. She leaned in, close her lips, brushing his ear. And the best part, since you obtained that money illegally through the company my father now owns, he's suing you for restitution. You won't just lose the money, Brandon. You're going to owe him. You're going to be in debt for the rest of your life. She pulled back, looking at him with pity. You thought you won, but you were playing checkers, and my father invented the chessboard. Get him out of here, William commanded. Security guards, actual large men with earpieces, moved in. They grabbed Brandon by the arms. He kicked and shouted, his dignity completely shattered. Julia, help me, Dad. William, please, don't call me Dad. William growled as Brandon was dragged toward the exit. To you, I'm Mr. Sanders, the man who owns your debt. As Brandon was hauled out of the double doors, thrashing like a child, the room remained silent for 1 second longer. Then William Sanders turned to the stunned crowd. My apologies for the interruption, he said, his voice booming and jovial once more. The open bar is reopened. Please enjoy the shrimp. It's excellent. The tension broke. The chatter resumed louder than before. Everyone wanted to be the first to congratulate William, to meet Julia, to distance themselves from the radioactive crater that was Brandon Pierce. Julia stood by her father's side, watching the doors close. She took a sip of champagne. It tasted like victory. The hangover Brandon woke up with the next morning was nothing compared to the reality that hit him when he checked his phone. He was in a hotel room, a cheap one near the airport. He hadn't gone back to the penthouse because his keycard hadn't worked. The concierge, the same one who had politely called his car the night before, had looked at him with polite disdain and informed him that the lease on the penthouse was corporate and his access had been revoked, pending an internal investigation. He had tried to use his credit cards to book a suite at the Ritz, declined all of them, even the Platinum Amex he kept for emergencies. He sat on the lumpy mattress of the motel staring at his phone. 47 missed calls, none from Tiffany. Most were from reporters. A few were from Arthur Banks, his lawyer. He dialed Arthur. Brandon. Arthur sounded breathless, panicked. Where are you? There are reporters outside my office. Outside your apartment. It's a bloodbath. Fix this. Arthur. Brandon snapped through. His voice lacked its usual bite. Get the accounts unfrozen. Threaten the bank. Tell them it's a mistake. I can't, Arthur whispered. Brandon, listen to me. I received a frantic call from the Cayman trustee this morning. They've been served with a freeze order, not just a local one, an international injunction. Sanders' lawyers are using the RICO Act. RICO, Brandon screamed. That's for mobsters. I'm a sales VP. They're framing it as a criminal enterprise, Arthur explained rapidly. They are arguing that you used Omnicorp's logistics network to smuggle high-value goods off the books and sold them through shell companies. They have shipping manifests, Brandon. They have emails signed by you authorizing containers that never existed on the official log. Brandon went cold. He had done that. It was a side hustle he thought was untraceable. He would mark a container as damaged or lost, write it off, and then sell the contents, electronics, luxury goods, on the black market. It had generated millions. How do they have that? Julia, Arthur said. The name hung in the air like a curse. Julia didn't know about the containers, Brandon insisted. She didn't know anything. She knew where you kept your do not touch hard drive. Arthur said she walked into the DA's office this morning with a physical hard drive. She told them she thought it contained family photos you were hiding from her, but when she opened it, she found spreadsheets. She's playing the innocent, confused wife card perfectly, Brandon. She's claiming she turned it over to clear her conscience. Brandon threw the phone across the room. It bounced off the cheap drywall and cracked. He paced the small, dingy room. This couldn't be happening. He was Brandon Pierce. He was a winner. He always landed on his feet. He needed leverage. He needed something on William Sanders. He grabbed his laptop. Thankfully, he had grabbed his personal bag before being thrown out of the gala. He booted it up and started searching. William Sanders, Sanders Holdings, Ares Ventures. He found articles, hundreds of them, but not the kind he wanted. Sanders saves failing steel mill, saves 500 jobs. William Sanders donates $50 million to orphanage network. The silent billionaire. How Sanders built an empire on ethics. The man was clean, squeaky clean. He was known for being ruthless with corrupt incompetence, but incredibly generous with honest workers. He was the anti-brand. There was a knock on the motel door. Brandon froze. "Who is it?" "Room service," a muffled voice said. Brandon hadn't ordered room service. He approached the door slowly and looked through the peephole. It wasn't room service. It was a process server, a short, balding man holding a thick stack of papers. Brandon slumped against the door. He opened it. "Brandon Pierce," the man asked cheerfully. "Yeah," Brandon croaked. "You've been served." The man shoved the papers into Brandon's chest. "Civil suit from Omnicorp. Civil suit from Julia Pierce for fraud and distress. And looks like a subpoena for the grand jury." Brandon let the papers fall to the floor. As he bent down to pick them up, his phone rang again. The cracked screen still worked. It was a number he didn't recognize. "Hello, Mr. Pierce?" A crisp, professional female voice spoke. "This is Linda from the HR department at Omnicorp." "I know I'm fired, Linda," Brandon spat. "You don't have to rub it in." "Actually, Mr. Pierce, I'm calling about your company car. The GPS indicates it is currently parked at the Starlight Motel on Route 9. A recovery team is 2 minutes away. Please remove your personal belongings immediately or they will be disposed of. You're taking the car now. It is company property, sir. And since you are under investigation for Grand Lassie policy dictates immediate asset recovery. Have a nice day." The line went dead. Brandon looked out the window. A tow truck was already pulling into the lot. It was a massive black tow truck. On the side in discreet gold lettering, it said Sanders Recovery Services. Of course, he owned the tow truck company too. Brandon grabbed his bag and ran out to the car, frantically pulling out his gym clothes, his spare shoes, and a box of mints. The tow truck driver, a burly man who looked vaguely like William Sanders, didn't even acknowledge him. He just hooked up the luxury sedan and lifted it into the air. As the car, his symbol of status, his pride and joy, was dragged away. Brandon stood in the parking lot of a cheap motel holding a bag of dirty laundry. A black limousine pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down. It was Arthur Banks, his lawyer. "Arthur." Brandon ran over. "Thank God. Give me a ride. We need to go to the bank." Arthur didn't unlock the door. He looked at Brandon through the open window with a mixture of pity and fear. "I can't represent you anymore, Brandon," Arthur said. "What? You're my lawyer. I paid you a retainer." "The retainer was paid from the account that has been frozen by the feds." Arthur explained, "Technically, that money is proceeds of crime. I can't touch it, and I can't be seen with you. My firm does a lot of business with Ares Ventures. If I represent you, Sanders pulls his contracts." "You coward!" Brandon screamed, slamming his hand against the door. "You helped me set up the shell companies." "Allegedly," Arthur said smoothly. "And if you say that in court, I'll testify that you misled me and falsified documents. It's your word against mine, Brandon. And right now, your word is worth less than the Venezuelan bolivar." Arthur rolled up the window. "Good luck, Brandon. I'd recommend a public defender. I hear the ones in this county are overworked." The limo peeled away, leaving Brandon in a cloud of exhaust. He was alone, completely alone. But the worst was yet to come. Because while Brandon was losing his things, Julia was busy reclaiming her life. Back at the old suburban house, the one Brandon had generously let her keep, Julia was sitting in the living room. But it wasn't the sad, lonely place it had been yesterday. William was there sitting in Brandon's favorite leather recliner, looking comically large for the chair. He was drinking a beer and watching a baseball game. Did they get the car? William asked without looking away from the TV. Linda called. Said it's on the hook, Julia replied, smiling. She was sorting through boxes, not packing boxes, but unboxing. She was taking out the things she had hidden away to keep Brandon from criticizing them. Her paints, her easel, her collection of vintage records. Good, William grunted. I never liked that car. Too flashy. German engineering is overrated if the driver's a fool. Dad, Julia said, pausing, is it too much? The lawsuit, the RICO charges. William muted the TV. He turned to look at his daughter. The softness in his eyes was a stark contrast to the granite look he gave Brandon. Ellie, that man stole 10 years of your life. He made you feel small so he could feel big. He isolated you. He gaslighted you. The money he stole from the company, that's just business. I can write that off. He leaned forward. But what he did to your spirit, that's personal. And Sanders' men don't write off personal debts. We collect them. He's going to go to prison, isn't he? Julia asked. For a while, William nodded. The feds don't like tax evasion. But when he gets out, he'll be broke. He'll have a felony record. He'll never work in high finance again. He'll have to start over, Julia mused. Like I am. No, William corrected her. You are starting over with a clean slate, $1 billion safety net, and a father who loves you. He is starting over in a hole he dug himself with no ladder. William stood up and walked over to her. He handed her a set of keys. What's this? I know you wanted to keep this house, William said, but the memories here are bad and the plumbing is shot. Julia looked at the keys. They had a logo on the keychain, a stylized H. There's a property uptown, William said. Brownstone, old historic, needs a lot of work, needs someone with an artistic eye to fix it up. I bought it this morning under your name. Your maiden name? Julia's eyes filled with tears. Dad, I can't. You can, he said firmly. You're a Sanders. We build things. Now go get changed. We have a meeting with the board of directors at 2:00 p.m. Me. Why? Because, William smiled, I fired the VP of sales last night. I need someone I can trust to oversee the transition. Someone who knows how to spot a liar. You're the interim VP, Julia. I ran a library program, Dad. I don't know sales. You managed a household with a narcissist for a decade on a budget he strangled. William laughed. You can handle a sales team. Besides, you own 10% of the company now. It's time you learned how to run it. Julia looked at the keys, then at her father. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like a victim. She felt like a force of nature. Okay, she said, clutching the keys. Let's go. 2 weeks later, Brandon Pierce was a man haunting the edges of his own life. He was out on bail thanks to a bail bondsman who had taken his grandmother's antique ring, the only asset he had managed to smuggle out in his pocket as collateral. He was staying in a basement studio apartment in a part of the city he used to joke about being a war zone. The walls were thin, the radiator clanked like a dying engine, and the smell of mildew was a permanent roommate. He had spent the last 14 days in a state of manic denial. He was convinced there was a way out. There was always a loophole. He just had to find the leverage. He sat at a wobbly laminate table staring at a burner phone. He had one card left to play. During his time at Omnicorp, Brandon had brokered a secret, off-the-books deal with a rival logistics firm, Apex Freight. He knew their VP, a shark named Roger Sterling. Roger had always hinted that he'd pay handsomely for Omnicorp's client list, specifically the details of the exclusive government contracts William Sanders' companies held. Brandon still had the client list memorized. He had a photographic memory for numbers and names. It was the one talent that wasn't a lie. Roger will pay. Brandon muttered, his eyes bloodshot. He'll pay $500,000 for this, enough to flee the country. Biz, no extradition. He dialed the number. Sterling, a voice answered. Roger, it's Brandon, he whispered, hunching over the table. There was a pause. Brandon Pierce, you've got some nerve calling me. Your radioactive pal. The feds are watching anyone who even sneezes in your direction. Listen, Roger, I have the list, Brandon hissed. The Defense Department, routing numbers, the pharmaceutical supply chains, everything. It's all in my head. I can give it to you today. Cash only, 500 grand. Silence stretched on the line. Then Roger laughed. You really don't get it, do you? Get what? Sanders didn't just buy Omnicorp, Roger said. his voice dripping with amusement. After your little scandal broke, Omnicorp stock dipped for about 4 hours. Sanders bought the dip. Then he publicly announced a transparency audit. The stock skyrocketed. He's the darling of the industry right now. If I touch you, he crushes Apex like a bug. He sent a memo to every CEO in the sector. Anyone hiring or aiding Brandon Pierce will be considered an enemy of Ares Ventures. You're blacklisted, Brandon. Global blacklist. Roger, please lose this number. Click. Brandon stared at the phone. The walls of the basement seemed to close in. He was trapped. But desperation breeds delusion. If he couldn't sell the info, maybe he could use it to threaten the source. Julia. He convinced himself she was the weak link. She was soft. She had always been soft. If he could just get her alone, he could manipulate her. He could cry, beg, or threaten to release embarrassing personal details to the press. He could break her. He knew where she would be. Every Wednesday at noon, she used to go to a specific bakery near her old volunteer job. Old habits die hard. He put on a baseball cap and sunglasses. He looked less like a corporate executive and more like a stalker, which ironically was exactly what he had become. He took the bus, a humiliation in itself, to the Uptown district. He waited across the street from La Boulangerie. Sure enough, at 12:15, a black town car pulled up, but Julia didn't walk out alone. She stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards, and she didn't look like the woman who bought day-old bread to save money. She was wearing a tailored cream suit that screamed power. She was on the phone, gesturing decisively. She looked radiant. Brandon watched her, a mixture of lust and rage boiling in his gut. He waited for her to enter the bakery, then crossed the street, keeping his head down. He slipped past the distraction of a delivery truck and entered the bakery. The guards were outside. He had a window. Julia was at the counter inspecting a tray of pastries. Julia, he rasped, stepping up behind her. She stiffened, but didn't turn around immediately. She finished her transaction. And 2 espressos, please, to go. Then she turned. She looked at him through her own sunglasses, then lowered them. Her eyes were clear, cold, and utterly unimpressed. You're violating your restraining order, Brandon, she said calmly. That's another felony. I need to talk to you, he hissed, grabbing her arm. The contact was a mistake. Before he could blink, Julia twisted her arm, breaking his grip with a sharp, practiced movement she had certainly never known before. Don't touch me, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The old Julia would have apologized. She would have been scared. I'm not her. Look at you. Brandon sneered, trying to regain dominance, playing dress-up in Daddy's company. You think you're a businesswoman now? You're nothing. You're a fraud, just like me. No, Brandon, she said, taking a step toward him, forcing him back. I'm not like you. I learned the business in 2 weeks because I listen. You spent 10 years pretending to know it while you were busy stealing. I fixed your mess. I restructured the sales division. We're up 15% this quarter without your creative accounting. I can ruin you, Brandon shouted, drawing the attention of the entire shop. I know things. I know about your anxiety. I know about my what? Julia challenged. My panic attacks. I gave an interview to Forbes yesterday about mental health in the workplace. I own my flaws, Brandon. That's why they don't control me anymore. You're owned by your secrets. She signaled to the window. The 2 guards were already moving in. I need money, Julia. Brandon's voice cracked, shifting from aggression to pathetic begging in a second. I have nothing. I'm eating ramen. Help me for old time's sake. Just 10 grand, please. Julia looked at him. Really? Looked at him. She saw the stained collar of his shirt, the desperation in his eyes, and she felt nothing. No hate, no love, just a mild inconvenience. No, she said. Why? He cried. You have billions because you haven't learned, she said. You still think you're entitled to things you didn't earn. Poverty might be the only teacher you respect. The guards grabbed him. This time he didn't fight. He just sagged, defeated by a woman he had underestimated for a decade. Get him out of here, Julia said, turning back to the counter to pick up her espressos. And call the police. Tell them Mr. Pierce has decided to revoke his own bail. The trial of the people versus Brandon Pierce was the high society event of the year. Though Brandon was no longer part of that society, he was the entertainment. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, former colleagues, and people he had stepped on during his climb. They all came to watch the fall. Brandon sat at the defense table next to a public defender named Gary. Gary was 26, overworked, and clearly thought Brandon was guilty. "Just plead out," Gary had whispered that morning. "They're offering 8 years. If we go to verdict, the judge is going to hammer you." No. Brandon had insisted, adjusting his cheap, ill-fitting suit. "I can charm the jury. I can explain that it was a misunderstanding, a corporate culture issue." He was wrong. The prosecution didn't just bring facts. They brought an avalanche. They brought the forensic accountant who traced every cent of the $3.2 million Brandon had siphoned. They brought the miscellaneous receipts for Tiffany's jewelry, the trips to Carbo, the lease on a sports car he claimed was for client transport. They brought his former assistant, Tiffany, who had been granted immunity in exchange for testimony. Tiffany on the stand was brutal. "Mr. Pierce told me that his wife was a simpleton who wouldn't understand finance." Tiffany told the jury, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. He laughed about it. He called her his insurance policy, someone who would never leave him because she had low self-esteem. The jury, 12 regular people who worked hard for their money, looked at Brandon with pure loathing. Then the prosecution called their final witness, William Sanders. William didn't need to shout. He sat in the witness box, hands folded on his cane, and spoke with the authority of a man who built empires. "Mr. Sanders," the prosecutor asked, "did you authorize any of these transfers?" "I did not," William said. "And as the new owner of Omni Corp, what was the impact of Mr. Pierce's actions?" William looked directly at Brandon. The monetary loss was negligible to the company. "We recovered, but the moral cost, he poisoned the culture. He made honest employees feel that cheating was the only way to advance. He betrayed the trust of his team, his shareholders, and his family. A man who steals money is a thief. A man who steals trust is a cancer." Brandon shrank in his seat. He tried to stare William down, but he couldn't. He looked away. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Guilty on all counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, perjury. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 days later. Brandon stood before Judge Keller, a woman known for her harsh sentences on white-collar crime. "Mr. Pierce," Judge Keller said, peering over her glasses, "throughout this trial I have looked for a shred of remorse. I have looked for an apology. Instead, I saw arrogance. You blamed the corporate culture. You blamed your wife. You even tried to blame the software." She paused. "You viewed people as assets to be liquidated. You treated your marriage as a tax shelter. You are a predator in a suit." "Your Honor," Brandon started. "Silence," she snapped. "The guidelines suggest 10 to 12 years, but given the aggravating factors, the violation of bail, the harassment of the victim, I am sentencing you to the maximum 15 years in a federal penitentiary. No parole eligibility for 85% of the sentence. Restitution of $3.2 million is ordered immediately. If you cannot pay your wages, will be garnished for the remainder of your natural life." The gavel banged. It sounded like a coffin lid slamming shut. As the bailiffs cuffed him, Brandon looked back into the gallery. He was looking for Julia. He wanted her to see him. He wanted to see her cry. He wanted some reaction. But Julia wasn't there. William was there. He stood in the back row. He nodded once at the judge, then turned and walked out. Brandon was dragged away, shouting that it wasn't fair that he was a vice president, that he was a Morton. The heavy door to the holding cell clicked shut, cutting off his screams. 6 months later, the federal prison camp was not the club-fed Brandon had expected. It was gray, cold, and loud. He worked in the laundry, folding sheets for 12 cents an hour. It was visiting day. Brandon didn't expect anyone. His parents had disowned him after the trial exposed the shame he brought on the family name. Tiffany was long gone, married to a plastic surgeon in Miami. "Pierce visitor," a guard yelled. Brandon's heart jumped. Julia, had she come to forgive him? Had she realized she missed him? He was led to the visitation room. He sat behind the plexiglass. On the other side sat Arthur Banks, his old lawyer. Arthur looked terrible. He had lost weight, his hair was messy, and he was wearing a cheap suit. "Arthur," Brandon picked up the phone. "What are you doing here? Did you find a way to appeal?" Arthur let out a hollow laugh. "Appeal? No, Brandon. I'm here to give you a heads up. I just got indicted." "What?" The DA followed your paper trail to me, Arthur said, rubbing his face tiredly. They offered me a deal if I gave up the other clients I helped hide money for. I took it. I'm going to a minimum security facility in Florida for 2 years. So why are you here? Because Arthur hesitated. I saw Julia yesterday before I surrendered my license. How is she? Brandon asked, leaning forward. Is she miserable? Is she struggling to run the company? Arthur looked at Brandon with pity. Brandon, she was on the cover of Time magazine this week, the new face of ethical business. She turned Omni Corp into the most profitable logistics company in the hemisphere. She's launching a foundation for women who survive financial abuse. Brandon felt like he couldn't breathe. But she's alone, right? She's engaged. Arthur dropped the bomb to a diplomat. Nice guy, treats her like gold. William walked her down the aisle at the engagement party. Arthur sighed. She gave me a message for you since I was coming here anyway. What is it? Brandon whispered. She said, tell him I hope he finds himself because he's the only person he has left. Arthur hung up the phone and walked away. Brandon sat there holding the receiver, listening to the dial tone. He looked at his reflection in the plexiglass. Gray skin, hollow eyes, a prison uniform. He had spent his whole life trying to be a somebody, terrified of being a nobody. And in his quest to win everything, he had become exactly that. Brandon walked back to his bunk, the metal door clanging shut behind him with a finality that echoed in his bones. He sat on the thin mattress, staring at the concrete wall. For years, he had measured his worth by the zeros in his bank account and the envy in other men's eyes. He had treated loyalty as a weakness and love as a transaction. Now stripped of his suits, his status, and his freedom, he finally understood the truth. True power wasn't about intimidation or wealth. It was about the quiet strength of a woman who knew her worth and the unshakable resolve of a father protecting his child. Brandon had thought he was playing a game of chess against a pawn, never realizing he was sitting across from the grandmaster. He had bet everything on his own arrogance, and he had lost. In the silence of his cell, Brandon Pierce realized he was exactly where he belonged, left with nothing but the memory of the life he threw away.